It's been about a year since the 0.01 build of Manhunt 2 for the PSP emerged, and while it did answer a lot of questions about the game's development, especially when Rockstar London took over, there's a lot to be answered about the Rockstar Vienna era of development. Some features and textures and models in the PSP build make me wonder about the state of the game, what direction it was headed, and what the plans were for both companies before the final product was decided on. So in this video I'll be covering different aspects of the 0.01 build, specifically what mysteries remain about it, what hasn't been solved, what questions remain despite having the additional context of the build. Since the build itself is kind of like a puzzle with some pieces missing. We can assemble bits and pieces of the full picture, but some parts aren't there because we don't have the full perspective from Rockstar Vienna or Rockstar London, and we don't know the full depth of the original plans for the game. So we can only just take a look at the resources there and figure things out for ourselves. So let's dive into that. Let's take a look at some of the strange aspects of this build and try to piece together what all it means. To start off, most obvious point. What point does Rockstar London's work begin, and at what point does Rockstar Vienna's work end? Because Rockstar London took over for Rockstar Vienna, there's a lot of controversy around that. Rockstar Vienna worked on the game from 2004 to 2006, and around the midpoint of 2006, they were abruptly shut down without warning. They just found the office closed, and work was shipped over to Rockstar London along with some other companies under Rockstar's domain. It isn't quite clear why that happened. Maybe the higher-ups at Rockstar weren't happy with Vienna's version of the game, but the fact remains that their vision for Manhunt 2 kinda floundered as a result. Rockstar London took over, and the PSP build is somewhere between the original Vienna vision and Rockstar London's vision. So we can see some differences. I think some of the bigger tells are with the executions. Rockstar Vienna's executions are a little more cartoonish in the way the animations are done, if you look closely at them. Especially with like the original toilet execution and the jumping machete execution. The movements, they don't look stiff, but they look kinda odd, exaggerated. The executions that show up in the final game are more down to earth and realistic, I guess you could say. Not that the Vienna era executions are bad, they're just different. You can see this with the guillotine as well. My guess is that Rockstar London probably tweaked the remaining executions to have more of a realistic style instead of a more exaggerated style. And the ones they didn't have time to fix up or the ones they weren't happy with, they just scrapped. I am curious though. It feels like by the time Rockstar London took over, the levels like Sorority House and History Museum were already cut. At least, I'd imagine Sorority House was, since Rockstar Vienna devs admitted it was kind of boring. History Museum I'm not as sure about, because they seem pretty proud of it. Maybe London just couldn't get to work in their vision of the story, or maybe it was having other issues. We know that at least a preview image of it existed. Same with Sorority House, same with A20, the original finale level. And on that note, a friend of mine had recently suggested that Rockstar Vienna may have gone for a goofier, more comedic tone, like a dark comedy sort of vibe, for their version of the game, which I can see. I mean, some of their pitches definitely fall under that domain, like the Frisbee one, where a guy's being manipulated by a puppet to go around killing people. It's ridiculous. It's a cool idea, but yeah, it's crazy. I could see that reflecting a slightly more comedic edge to the game. And maybe the original animations are meant to reflect that. They were supposed to have this lightness to them that like a cartoon would. So there's a bit of bleak comedy in the way you're taking down enemies. But that's speculation, at least based on what we can see in the PSP build. The second part is about the time period of the game. And I don't mean about the theories of the game being set in the Cold War. I'm almost positive that wasn't the case, and I'd love to do a video about that theory and other theories sometime. No, I'm talking about the futuristic angle, especially in this build, possibly even in earlier builds. If you look at the original Project Militia, they're pretty out there with designs. Like the main design of like the guy in the black suit with the green goggles and the gas mask, that's a little out there, but it's nothing too crazy compared to the Cerberus from Manhunt 1. Same with the gas mask beta militia and the ballistic mask one. But then there's the militia enemy that has a gas mask with these antenna-like parts and the 6 red goggle eyes. And that has all sorts of implications. Like, is it implied the project were modifying people to be more than human? Is it implied that this was set in some sort of future or some alternate world where human augmentation has reached a point where that's possible? I mean, is the mask just there for intimidation, like some of the masks you see in Manhunt 1? There's a lot to read into because we don't get a clear answer on that. They're just there in the 0.01 build. The same also goes for the SWAT heads. In the regular version of Manhunt 2, the SWAT just have regular gas masks and helmets and balaclavas. But in the 0.01 build, they have these really futuristic and cartoony looking helmets with like radio antennas coming out and like glowing green goggles and bright metallic parts. It looks cool, but it clashes with the art style completely. And it makes me wonder, at some point in development, was this meant to have more of a futuristic vibe? I mean, I could be reading too far into it. Some people have made arguments about the game being set in the Cold War because Broadcast Interrupted has really antiquated recording technology, and the game builds off elements of MKUltra. Well, the problem with that is we're only getting bits and pieces of the original story, so you could make as much argument for it being set in the past as you can in the future. But it seems like there was an angle to at least present futuristic elements. That's my argument. My question is, how far did they go? And right now we don't have a definitive answer, because the weapons still seem like they would be set in a early to mid-2000s era. Not really in a futuristic one. There aren't any advanced rifles or anything of the sort. GTA has been willing to venture into future territory in all of its games, but Manhunt not so much, so it leaves me wondering. The next bit is about Frisbee, who I brought up before, because his model and textures are in the 0.01 build. We had heard about him, we'd seen the menu footage that was meant to be like a preview of the art style, so we knew about the existence of this character and the potential for the story about him, or about the person he was controlling. And there are some homages to it left in the files, like the show Frankie and the Freaks being labeled as Frisbee and the Freaks, as an unused texture. The strange thing is, though, apparently during development, Frisbee was just used as a placeholder. Whenever there needed to be an item somewhere and it wasn't ready yet, Frisbee would be placed there as like a key reminder that's like, okay, something is here that shouldn't be here, so replace it before the game ships. Which is a smart idea. Valve does something similar with Source Engine games, where it'll have this bright pink and black checkerboard texture on anything that's missing a texture. And the problem is, that's a simple texture. You can make that in seconds in Paint.net. Frisbee is fully modeled, fully textured, rigged for animations. People have made mods where you replace Danny or Leo with him. And that's a lot of work to be put into something that's just a placeholder. It makes me wonder, did the Frisbee era of storytelling in Manhunt go further than just the initial pitch? Were they actually pushing forward with that story idea before it shifted toward the project? And if so, how far did it get? I get the feeling there was at least some progress made on the Frisbee story concept, on the puppet controlling the protagonist. Because when that much detail and that much work is put into something and it's just dismissed as a placeholder, I don't buy that. At least, I think Rockstar London was using it as a placeholder. I think Vienna actually had plans for it. Either having Frisbee show up as an Easter egg in Broadcast Interrupted as a minor story element, or maybe even the original pitch of Manhunt 2, with him being the equivalent of Leo and taunting and encouraging the player. There's also some speculation about the religious extremist story aspect that got cancelled, but there isn't really much evidence for that outside of the Beta Legion, and that's a topic for another time. Speaking of the Legion, the next part I want to cover is the stuff that I thought would have been in this build, but wasn't. There are some glaring omissions that seem like they would be present. I found it strange, which indicates that either they were cut early by Vienna, or they were implemented by Rockstar London. I'm talking about the Legion in Domestic Disturbance, which seems like it was a beta element pretty early on, to the point where there's still voice support for them. The Project Militia in Release Therapy, the Desert Eagle or Heavy Handgun showing up in Safe House and then getting removed before the release of the game. And as well, I would say the odd choice to have Leo present in certain scenarios where he shouldn't be there. Like in the opening to level 3, where in the original cutscene he climbs the fence of the nightclub with Danny. Or how in Most Wanted, he's running away from the police with Danny, going another way so they can split up and try to divide up the amount of people chasing them. Which shouldn't be happening if Leo is just a figment of Danny's imagination. You could argue that it's just him preserving the masquerade and making it seem like, oh, he's still real and all that, but I'm not sure how much I buy into it. It feels like that's an element of the version of the story where Leo might have been a real person on the run with Danny. Same goes for him showing up in the cutscene of Sexual Deviance, because there's no reason for him to be animated there, and it's a good kind of foreshadowing to not show him climbing it with Danny, because in reality he isn't. Danny's the only one making it in there. That's speculation, though. There's a lot of speculation in this, but there's only so much I can do. Same goes for the Desert Eagle, the heavy handgun in Safe House. It seems like Rockstar London was the one who toyed with that idea, since the original cutscene without animations doesn't feature the Desert Eagle, the one that presumably Rockstar Vienna made. When Rockstar London took over, and they did the PS2 AO build, it was replaced with the heavy handgun, and the cutscene was animated to reflect that. But by the time the game was finalized, it was switched back to a revolver, and the cutscene was kind of hastily switched to make the revolver take its place, but it's awkward. The animation's all floaty. It's a really big and noticeable error. It does make me wonder why the change was made, though. I mean, both guns work fine in that scenario, but the back and forth aspect is what surprised me. Like, was Rockstar London testing that change out when they were doing the AO build? And were they just not happy with the way it played compared to the revolver? Or were they thinking that they already got rid of the revolver in Best Friends, and that it needed to show up in at least one level, so Safe House was a safe bet? I don't know about that, honestly. The Project Militia in Release Therapy. I've had a long-standing theory that Release Therapy was meant to be a real location, and that it was actually meant to be a physical place where Leo fought his way through. And the stuff involving the Project Militia being there definitely adds to that. I'm surprised that I was skeptical about them being present, but outside of a voice line, and some texture documents referencing them, there really wasn't any evidence for it in the early builds. So my guess is that this was a Rockstar Vienna era choice. And I would say even further back, Rockstar Vienna probably made the choice to have the Legion in Domestic Disturbance, back when it wasn't a flashback and you were going after some project scientists in a neighborhood. I find it weird, though, that the voice lines for the Legion survived throughout development in Domestic Disturbance, which is why they're restored in some mods, while the Project Militia do not have their voice lines in release therapy, which is why mods that bring them back still have to use the Legion voice lines. I'm not sure if they were just saving on memory or what, because you'd think they would just clean house entirely. Maybe it was just tied to something important in Domestic Disturbance and they couldn't cut it without breaking the level. From what I understand, that was like the toughest level they had to make, especially when optimizing it for the PSP. And now, for a very important part. The voice acting. There's a lot of placeholder voice acting in the 0.01 build. But the strange thing is, there's still a decent amount by the official actors for Danny, Leo, and the other characters. This includes bits that we haven't even heard before. Leo's line of, "It's a pleasure being in your brain, Danny," which would have totally given away the twist about him being a figment of Danny's imagination. But maybe there was a point in development where Leo was considered like, okay, we'll just be upfront, Leo isn't real. Or maybe the twist would have been that Leo currently isn't real, but he used to be. And that whole theory of him being an IAA agent planted into Danny's head turned out to be the big twist, which could have been interesting. There's also the strange line in release therapy where Leo's placeholder voice actor has a bunch of lines, and then there's an unfitting final Leo line that doesn't show up anywhere else.
"I can smell freedom already. Just keep hammering them till they're all gone."
That one has its own implications, especially with the original subtitles and what all they implied about the character. Another character aspect is Dr. Whyte, who seems like she had more of a villainous role, at least when Rockstar Vienna was handling the game. There's also the question of her appearance in Bee's Honeypot's outro. You're chasing Judy Sender throughout the level, but at the end, in the cutscene where Judy is ultimately sniped by the Bloodhounds, Dr. Whyte's model is used instead, even though Judy's voice appears. It's strange, because this isn't in any other build. I don't know if this indicates that Dr. Whyte was supposed to be the one you were pursuing, if maybe she was just used as a placeholder while they got another model together for Judy. Maybe they originally used the GIMP one there and decided to replace it. Or maybe Dr. Whyte was going to fake her death in Bee's Honeypot, so she could throw Danny and Leo off her trail. Which then ties into the whole aspect of Altered State, where the opening part and ending are totally different. Where she was supposed to tranquilize Danny at the beginning instead of the end. At the end of the level, Danny finds Leo in a wheelchair for some reason, and he's acting as though he's a real person. And Dr. Whyte tranquilizes Danny once again, and proudly declares that the work is done, and everything went according to plan, as if she was meant to be a major antagonist after Pikmin died, instead of being the last bit of support Danny has.
"You're too late."
It's taken care of, exactly as planned.
It seems like her role was shifted. In the final game, she's more of an atoner, trying to make up for what she did to Danny and everybody else in the project, even if she still earnestly believes in the project. Whereas it seems like either in Rockstar Vienna's version of the game, or in an early version by Rockstar London, she was meant to be an antagonist. Someone who Danny and Leo were pursuing, but someone who had her own agenda for them both. I've got my own theories on that, but again, they're theories. We don't have concrete evidence one way or the other. There is something we do have concrete evidence of, though, and it's the craziest bit of Manhunt 2 lore and discoveries yet. You ready for it to get uncomfortable? Because this is where it gets uncomfortable. In the final section of release therapy for the 0.01 build, Leo fights Danny for control of his mind. But the initial conversation is different. The final game is a back and forth with Danny and Leo, where Leo is goading Danny, blaming him for the deaths of his family, even though Leo was the one who engineered it, in order to draw Danny out and kill him to take control of his mind. It kind of happens like that in the 0.01 build, but it's more of one chain of dialogue by Danny, one chain by Leo, and then a quick response by Danny. And there's an unfitting bit where Leo's final voice actor comes in and says, "I can smell freedom already, just keep hammering them, and we'll be out of here." And Danny blows up to that. It doesn't make any sense, but he loses it and says he's gonna kill Danny, he's gonna kill Leo, and that Leo's a psycho. It doesn't add up. It threw me off the first time I played it. And then you read through the subtitles for the level, and the original line spoken by Leo, which another user pointed out in his very long video, it's interesting, about Manhunt 2's development. The original line was, "Even your desire for your daughter is banal and suburban." Which, I mean, that potentially turns everything we know about Danny on its head. There are a lot of ways to read that. Is Leo just continuing to goad Danny? Is he saying stuff to deliberately enrage him and get him to show his face instead of lurking away because he knows he can ignore Leo? Is this a case of Leo projecting his own desires onto Danny? Was he craving Danny's daughter, and he's just saying this again to enrage Danny further? Or is Leo telling the truth? Was there an aspect of Manhunt 2's story where Danny had romantic interest in his own daughter? Which would have been totally messed up. I mean, Danny is a tragic character in the final story of Manhunt 2, and in the AO story of Manhunt 2, and in the 0.01 story. This would have painted him as a disgusting figure. I mean, Danny's daughter was at least college age, judging by the fact that she is in a sorority house in the flashback level. But that doesn't excuse the fact that, she's his daughter. And also the big issue of the fact that he's married as well. So if we take what Leo said at face value, that would explain the very strange image of Danny's daughter in Ghosts, where she's running away from Danny and telling him she's not scared of him and that he's a psycho, and Danny's frantically apologizing. Because that never happens. We never see that happen in any version of Manhunt 2. Nor do we see what led to that happening. And it can't be the death of Danny's wife, because he was completely under Leo's control when it happened. And after it happened, Pikmin arrived to shut him down completely. There was no time for him to come to his senses and frantically apologize to his daughter about it.
Am I going crazy?
That is not the context for it, even though in the final game that's what the implication is. So that leads me to believe this might have been a scene where Danny tries to reunite with his daughter, and she's horrified and disgusted by him, and he doesn't get why, because he doesn't remember whatever he did or Leo did in his body, whatever things might have been said or anything of that sort. That's speculation, but the subtitles say what they say, and it adds up in terms of Danny's visceral reaction to it. There's plenty to speculate about for this build of Manhunt 2. And I look forward to delving into it more, because discoveries are still being made. I was led to figure out about the spiked baseball bat being in Bee's honeypot, which I hadn't even realized. And there are all sorts of other cut items and things of that sort that I missed out on, like the shotgun with light being in the personality clash level, or as it's called there, cemetery. Up next, I actually want to do a video about a hypothetical PS2 or Xbox 0.01 build. Because we know that Rockstar Vienna, they completed the game around 2006. A build of it for consoles was finished around mid-2006. If this build exists, which I have a strong inclination that it does, it likely has a treasure trove of early concepts and story beats, and a good idea of what Rockstar Vienna's vision for the game was before they got shut down. Since, from what I understand, those employees are probably under NDA, they probably can't go up and admit that. So I don't blame them for not sharing all the details of the story. Still, I'm hopeful that there is a disc version of this build, since that would be the most legal way to acquire it. I don't endorse hacking of any kind, and I feel like you're doing a disservice to developers by taking their stuff. So, just like how the 0.01 build on the PSP showed up on eBay one day, I hope that a 0.01 build for the PS2 or Xbox will show up on eBay or some other site, and that some fan will be able to dump it for us all to explore. Until then, we can just dig through the files we already have and speculate. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.